Hello everybody, Raven Knight here, and welcome to our first day going through the life of David. Go ahead and open your Bible to 1 Samuel. We're going to start in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, but then we're going to jump to chapter 16 real quick. So go ahead and get out your Bible and go to 1 Samuel 13. Some of you may be saying, Raven, you just said this is the first day. I thought we already did this. I thought you already started our David Bible study. And we have. We technically did, but that day was more meant to introduce you to who David was, why he's important in the Bible, give you kind of an understanding of why this series is so important. But the goal of this series, and I want to reiterate this, the goal of this series is to understand what it means to be a man after God's own heart, to live with faith while also being flawed. How do we do it? The big question I want us to ask in this series is, how can someone be flawed but still be a man after God's own heart? Because we are fundamentally flawed. So how can we live like David? What can we learn from the life of David in terms of how he was close to God? And so to start things off, we need to get right to the heart of things. We need to get right to the heart of the matter, right to the soul of the issue, and learn about what a man after God's own heart looks like. So let's get started. Let's not waste any time. I can't wait to dive into this series. So in 1 Samuel chapter 13, now we haven't gotten to David yet. This is about Saul. So a little bit of background on Saul, the first king of Israel. The people of Israel at this time were pretty upset. They wanted a king because they looked at all the nations around them and they said, you know what, the big difference between us and all these other nations is they have kings. We want a king. We want a king of our own. So they told Samuel, who was their prophet, sent from God, saying, we want a king, anoint for us a king to rule over us. So Samuel brought the issue to God, and God said, that's not a good idea. A human king is going to be a very bad thing for you. You don't want this. Trust in me, I'm your king. You don't need a king, I'm your king. But the people said, no, God, we need a king. Trust us, we need a king. We're gonna want a king. So God finally said, all right, then I'm gonna choose you a king. And it's going to be the kind of king y'all want. And so he chose Saul. Now, Saul was a tall, handsome, brave, strong young man, and the people loved him. But Saul was also arrogant. Saul was selfish. There was a lot of problems with Saul, and we're going to see that here. We're going to start in verse 13. Now, at this point, Saul had been asked to go out and decimate Gilgal, which was a home of the Philistines. And he told them, go forth and wipe them out, all of them. But he didn't. He didn't do it. He didn't obey God's orders. And so here's what Samuel had to say to him when God said, Samuel, Saul hasn't done what I told him to do. Go talk to him. Tell him this is what I said. So Samuel goes to him, and in verse 13, he says, you have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. This is the first time the phrase, a man after God's own heart, appears in verse 14. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. And what essentially this means is God said, Saul was not a man after my own heart. I chose him because I wanted the people of Israel to see what they get when their king, their choice of a king, is put on the throne. Now I'm going to pick someone. I'm going to pick someone more after my own heart. I'm going to pick someone more fitting. So Saul has been rejected as king, but why? That's the big question. Why was Saul rejected? In many ways, he's the kind of man that you'd think would be a king. He's strong, he's brave, he's fierce, he's determined. He's all the things in a bag of chips, you know? What was the problem? Samuel lays it out. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. And he repeats it. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Obedience. That's key. Obedience is very key. So that explains why Saul was rejected. And if you go on to chapter 15, it goes into another story, a story where Saul once again did wrong, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. We're going to come back to Saul in chapter 15. Like I said, we're going to be jumping around. This isn't going to be like Romans, where we just read one chapter and then we're done. We're going to be hopping around the Old Testament with this, so let's get right into the fun stuff. We're going to chapter 16 now, chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. called Samuel Anoints David, and we're going to be starting in verse 1. And what I want you guys to do is, if you have a piece of paper or something you can take notes on, I want you to write some things down for me. This will be a good little exercise for you guys, because I think this is something for you to meditate on. I want you to write down the principles for heart development. If you're going to be someone after God's own heart, then you need to develop your heart, and these are the ways you do it. These are the principles for heart development, and I cannot take credit for this. This was actually taught to me by my former pastor, Dr. Pack. So let's get started. Verse 1, chapter 16. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Now, I wanted to read that opening part specifically because here is God saying to Samuel, stop mourning over Saul. It's time to move on. I need you to go anoint my chosen. It's time for you to go out there. And I think there's a lesson in that. It is sometimes life can throw difficulties at you, and it's not wrong to mourn, but there's a time to move on too. And God is ready to bring his chosen up and introduce him to Israel. So, let's skip ahead just a little bit. We're going to skip a little bit ahead. All right, so Samuel goes and he gets to Bethlehem and he meets the elders of the town, and they take him before Jesse. And we're going to pick up in verse 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw ILab. ILab is the oldest son of Jesse. When they arrived, Samuel saw ILab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. So the first thing Samuel did was he was looking at Jesse and his 7 sons, and he sees ILab walk in front of him, the oldest son, and he says, this guy's gotta be it. Look at him. He's tall, he's big, he's strong. He reminds me a bit of Saul. This has got to be it. But the Lord said, verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And this is the first thing I want you to write in your notes under the principles for heart development. Number 1. Ready? Inward integrity surpasses outward impressions. Inward integrity surpasses outward impressions. You know, people like to say all the time, you only get one chance to make a first impression. But here's the funny thing. What if you make a bad first impression and that's not really who you are? See, there's always something underneath. God does not look at what's on the outside. God looks at what's on the inside. He looks at who you are as a person. Keep in mind, when Saul was chosen, people liked him for his looks. People liked him for how he appeared. And the first thing Samuel did when he looked at ILab is, now this guy looks pretty good. This has got to be it. And God said, don't look at him for his height or his looks. None of that. It's not what I look at. You need to look at someone for who they are. And that's the way God wants us to look at one another. Don't look at them for how they appear. Look at them for how they are at heart. Want to hear something kind of scary? Back when Bill Clinton was running against George W. Bush, or maybe it was his father, back when Bill Clinton was running, there was a poll going around asking many people in America why did they vote for who they did, and a large number of them said that they voted for Bill because he looked good. He looked good. Can you believe that? When did voting for a leader of a country suddenly turn into a looks contest? But here's the reality. Lots of people have no understanding of the heart or of politics or of running of a country. What they do understand is, ooh, I find that attractive. We all can look at something and decide whether we think it looks good or not. We have that ability to discern things based on appearances. We all do it. But not all of us have the heart or the eyes to recognize the heart. And so the first thing that you need to remember for a principle for heart development is that inward integrity surpasses outward impressions. How someone appears, how someone looks, how someone stands is not telltale of who they are as a person. And it's the same for you. Who you are as a person is reflected by who you are inside, and that's what God sees. I met this guy once. He used to go to my church a long time ago, back before I moved. This guy was the definition of a ragamuffin, as my dad would say. He had messy hair. He was untrimmed. He was rather skinny. And I don't think he owned a single collared shirt. In fact, he often showed up in dirty clothes, and the reason why was because he was a construction worker, and most of his clothes were dirty and covered in clay. But here's the thing about this guy. He was one of the most faithful people I ever knew. Always had a Bible verse to quote. Very intelligent individual. Very smart. Very well versed in the Bible. Looked like a ragamuffin. But I knew him as a man of God because of how he appeared. Do you know anyone like that? Just a thought. All right. Let's keep going. We just finished up verse 7. Then Jesse called Abinadab, the second son, and him passed in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? You got to think at this point, Samuel's a little confused. You know, God said, you're going to choose a son of Jesse. You're going to go and choose a son of Jesse to be my anointed. And he's saying, well, because he says in verse 2, the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate. So he knows one of Jesse's children is going to be the next king. He's seen all 7 pass in front and God rejected every single one of them. So there's only one conclusion that can be drawn from this. Jesse's holding out somebody. So he says, are these all the sons you got? Now watch what happens next. This is interesting. There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. Now notice the way he said that. Guys, can you believe? Let's reread that. There is still the youngest, Jesse answered. He is tending the sheep. Several things we can take for that. Number 1, Jesse doesn't even call David by his name. Can you believe that? Imagine that. Someone coming by and meeting my brother and saying, oh, didn't you have another son? Oh, yeah, he's the oldest one. He's upstairs. Not even referring to my name. And Jesse couldn't even be bothered to do that. Number 2, oh, there's still the youngest. In other words, yeah, there is one more, but I didn't think he was important enough to invite for the sacrificial dinner. I didn't think he was important enough to bring before you. How little did Jesse think of his youngest son? I mean, my goodness. And then the last part, he is tending the sheep. Let me be clear. Being a shepherd is not an easy job, nor it is a well-liked job. Usually the shepherd is the person that is the servant. We can take from this that Jesse's family, David's family, was not wealthy. Because if they were wealthy, they would have servants doing this. They would have slaves doing this. David, the youngest, would not be doing it. Being a shepherd is a dirty, demeaning, and very lowly job, and yet that's where he is. When the prophet of the Lord appears in town to offer a sacrificial dinner and invites Jesse and his whole family to join in, Jesse says, okay, I'll invite everyone but my youngest son. That's awful. That is awful. But Samuel says, follow that up, Samuel said, send for him, we will not sit down until he arrives. Verse 12. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. So we get our first idea of what David looks like. He's pretty fine looking. He's handsome enough. You know, he's the youngest, but you know, he's decent looking. He's probably not super handsome like his older brother. He's probably not super musculature. He's probably pretty small. You know, he is the youngest. He is mostly overlooked, but he comes in, probably smells of the field, probably smells like sheep. He probably looks a little dirty, you know, but he comes in. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. Rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Before we move on, we're going to add some more principles for heart development. The first we're going to add is that ordinary places are extraordinary classrooms. I'm going to repeat that. Ordinary places are extraordinary classrooms. Let me remind you, David was a shepherd. And that's about as lowly and ordinary a job as you can think. You know, in today's day, when we think of politicians who rise up in the ranks, usually they're born to money or born to wealth or born to power. They went to the best schools. They had the best upbringing. They have enough money that they feel like it's going out of style. They are completely disconnected from the ordinary world because they've lived with a silver spoon in their mouth for most of their life. David came from an ordinary place and became the king of Israel. A lot of you may be thinking right now, you know, I can't be like David. I'm not nearly as special as he is. God isn't coming to anoint me with oil. I'm not meant for much. I have a dead-end job. I'm still stuck in school. My parents don't really care for me all that much. Every day of my life is pretty mundane and normal. Nothing really interesting happens to me. But David had that exact same position, maybe even worse, because shepherds were not well liked. They were a filthy, filthy profession. And the ordinary place that David started out in is where he had the best training. Because God wanted to use a shepherd to lead his people. Why? Because Jesus himself was called the Good Shepherd. He wanted to embody the understanding of what a shepherd does when leading his people. And David learned a lot of skills. He learned patience, dealing with very dumb animals that are hard to follow. He learned how to protect his flock. He learned how to fight off the lions, the bears, the wolves, the monsters that would show up and try to take his sheep. He learned how to think and plan. Because when you're sitting alone with a bunch of sheep all day, you got a lot of time to think for yourself and think about things. David learned how to be an effective leader and how to lead his people by first learning from his ordinary place. God has a plan for you. If you are with God and God is in your heart, God has a plan for you, and you may not know what that plan is. You may not know when God is ready to activate it, but know this, where you are right now, God is using you and training you and preparing you. I'll give you an example from my own life. I really wanted to go to Asia. For a long time, I really wanted to go, and I got news that my church was running a mission trip over to Japan during the Tokyo Olympics, and I was so hyped. I put down my down payment. I was meeting with the group every few weeks to prepare and plan things out. I was practicing my language skills. I was stoked. Then COVID happened, and the trip was canceled, and I was so bummed out. I said, God, I thought this is it. I thought this is where you wanted me to go. But then I began to realize something as I really prayed and thought about it. It wasn't time yet. God does things in his own time, and I hadn't finished preparing yet. I needed to practice my language skills more. I needed to put more money in the bank, and I had to get my heart more right with God before I made this trip. Though what I'm doing now is pretty ordinary, pretty basic, God is preparing me for something greater, just like what God was doing with David. David probably had no idea what God had in store for him, probably didn't think it was a whole lot, and now here he is anointed in front of his brothers, as we read in verse 13. The second thing that I want you to write down. God's leading dwarfs man's opinions. God's leading dwarfs man's opinions. Read verse 13 again. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day on the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Now compare that with verse 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. I don't know about you guys, but that terrifies the heck out of me. Those two verses right side by side. Look at this again. From that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Jump to 14. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul. How easy it is for the Spirit of God to come upon someone and also for it to leave someone. Now, why did the Spirit of God leave Saul? We talked about his disobedience, but let's go even further into it. Like I said, we're going to flip back to chapter 15. I told you we'd come back here. Turn to chapter 15. It's right behind 16. We're going to pick up in verse 22. Verse 22. So what's happened here is that Saul was given an order once again to wipe out the Amalekites, to wipe out an enemy of Israel. And he didn't do it. He left some alive. He did not do as God commanded. And here he is making excuses, and Samuel says to him, verse 22, Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Verse 24, wait for this. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them. Saul here is making his excuse known. You're right. Okay, I didn't obey the Lord. I disobeyed. You're right. But I was scared of people's opinions of me. I'm the king, I'm King Saul. I've got to make a good impression on my men. And here if I don't do something that they want me to do, they're going to be upset with me. I gotta think about the way they see me, right? But God's leading dwarfs man's opinions. Saul was so caught up in the way other people saw him, so caught up in the way his subjects looked at him as king, that he said, you know what? I know I should obey the Lord, but their opinions are more important. And as a result, as it says in verse 14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. But where did it go? Verse 13. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Why? Because David does not let other people's opinions affect him. Not here, at least. Because you know what he could have said? He could have looked at Samuel and said, whoa, keep that oil off me. You know what? Because I don't want my brothers to be jealous. I don't want them to be angry. I wouldn't want people to look at me differently. No, he took it and went on with his day. He took it and said, okay, this is what the Lord has in store for me, and I will follow it obediently. God's lead dwarfs man's opinions. Now let's wrap this up. We're going to jump a little ahead now. We left off at verse 14 in chapter 16, so let's jump a little ahead. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Verse 15, Saul's attendant said to him, see, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord command his servants here to search for someone who can play the lyre. He will play when the evil spirit from God comes on you, and you will feel better. So Saul said to his attendants, find someone who plays well and bring him to me. Verse 18, one of the servants answered, I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him. Verse 19, then Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, send me your son David who is with the sheep. I want you to take note of that last bit. Send me your son David who is with the sheep. Guys, I want you to think about what that just said, what that means. David just got anointed by the Lord. He has been anointed by Samuel. He is now the next king anointed. He knows sometime in the future I'm going to be the new king. Does he immediately start trouncing around and saying, hey guys, you should look up to me, I'm the new king? Does he straight up walk to the palace and say, Saul, you better step down, I got the oil on my head, I'm the new king? Nope. Where does he go? Right back to the sheep. Right back to his fields. Why? Because this is the last one, the last principle of heart development that we're going to write down. Faithfulness in the small prepares you for the great. Faithfulness in the small prepares you for the great. David has been given a huge responsibility to be the king of Israel. And yet, despite that, he is still faithful to the small things. He is still faithful to the small, to the little, the things that, you think may not be that important. And now that he knows he's going to be king, he knows taking care of these sheep, that's not as big as I'm going to get. There's something way bigger out there. But David is faithful to this small responsibility of watching some sheep. And he sticks to it. Now you might think, now how does this relate to me? Some of you might be thinking about that ordinary circumstance I told you about. Why am I stuck in these ordinary, mundane circumstances? Have you thought that maybe you're getting ready for something? Think about this for a second. My dad used to work at a bank, right? That used to be what he did. And when you get promoted at a bank, you have to be very much scrutinized. If you can't be responsible with the small desk clerk job, how are you ready to go up and become like an office manager or something like that? How could you do that? I'm training to be a manager at Longhorns. Do you think that I could just walk in and say, hey, I'm ready to be manager, until I've proven that I can handle smaller jobs like waiting tables, sitting people, organizing things? Like, I've got to prove I'm ready for that, because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. Your faithfulness in smaller matters proves that you might be ready to handle bigger matters. Your faithfulness in the simple and the mundane and the small proves that you're ready for something greater. So those of you who are in school or at work or any other kind of mundane position, realize that. You may think, when am I going to get my day? When am I going to be able to sit on the top? When am I going to be able to get that promotion I wanted, or get that really good grade, or get that position? When am I going to get this? When are things going to turn out my way? A couple things you need to realize. Number one, that you're in an ordinary place that may be your extraordinary classroom, that previous principle. And two, you may still have to be faithful with some small things to prepare you for the big things to come. Now, I'm not saying that it's all going to happen quick, and patience is a virtue that God does emphasize in our lives. We need to be patient in God's timing, but the reality is, while you are waiting, you have work to do. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. You've got work to do, and while you have the time, I'd work on it. Let me put it like this, and then we'll start to wrap up. Let me put it like this. David is introduced to us as pretty much a nobody. Oh, he's handsome enough. He's not bad looking. But he's also the youngest of 8 sons. He is so meaningless to Jesse, he doesn't even get introduced with a name. He just says, oh, he's the youngest. He's out tending the sheep. And he's so meaningless, he's doing the dead-end job of just being a shepherd boy. He has to watch a bunch of dirty, dumb sheep. And yet, God made him king of Israel over Saul. Why? Because Saul thought that his opinions and the opinions of others were better than God's. He trusted other people's opinions over him to the point that he abandoned God's reason and God's love. And God pulled his spirit away from Saul and said, I reject you as king because you can't keep my commands. But now I'm going to bring my spirit upon one who is a man after my own heart, a man who is just nothing more than a shepherd boy who is the youngest of 8 sons. That's gotta really rub Saul the wrong way when he finds out. That's gotta really rub him the wrong way when he finds out. But now David is not just a shepherd boy, he's been called to be the personal lyre player for the king. David's moving up in the world. And it's because he was faithful with something small. So remember those 4 points about principles for heart development. If you feel like you need to get your heart right with God, I would start with those 4 principles. That's a good area to start. And today we have now gotten our glimpse into the beginning of David's walk with God. And we're going to move on. Next time we'll be talking about David and Goliath, probably the most famous story about David out there. Everyone knows this story, even people who aren't Christian, but we're going to look at it in a very unique way. We're going to be talking about how you conquer your own giants. I really look forward to that, but we're going to wrap up here today. Thank you so much for watching. I had a great time. I hope you are enjoying this series as we walk through David. Let me know in the comments what you thought and what you learned, and if you have any questions, would love to talk with you about it. This is going to be a great series, guys. Really excited to do it with you, and as always, I will see you in my next video. Take care.